In the modern society that we live in today, that is largely governed by sports watches, there are some very rare and special examples that aren't looked at, that deserve a lot more love and attention. And the Vacheron Constantin Historiques American 1921 is such a good piece. It resembles so many things, so many facets of the time when it was created, and it truly does deserve so much more appreciation. I have spoken about this piece before on the channel, but since it is its 100th anniversary this year, 2021, it deserves to be put in the spotlight. It deserves its own video. This is most definitely an undercover watch, and there are many of us here who appreciate this watch. We have spoken about it in the community often enough, but this model hasn't reached the appreciation it truly deserves in the broader watch community, which I find quite perplexing and worth investigating. You don't have to be an academic or anyone very experienced in this hobby to see why this watch has its own stature, its own status. It resembles the 1920s, a period where the Great War had just ended. The world was transitioning into this age of opulence, where everything was a lot more free-flowing, there was more creativity, more vibrance. This piece is defined by its offset dial, made to make it a bit more legible when it's on the wrist. You don't have to turn your wrist to see the time, which is quite a nice feature. It's a bit more functional. There is actually use behind its purpose, its intention. This is known by many as a racing watch, by others the preacher's watch. But beyond that defining key characteristic trait, there is a lot more to the form of the watch that deserves to be looked at. There is this ongoing trend, I believe, where watch design is becoming more and more generic, at least in areas where the broader community that we have collect pieces. The sports watch is defined by its steel case, by its no-nonsense case shape. Often these watches sacrifice things like numerals on their dials for elements like dots and dashes. You don't see details on pieces like a railroad minute track. You don't see lugs today that aren't integrated into the case somehow. And if we are to step back in time and really picture this as the sports watch of its day and age, the 1920s, we know that we had just transitioned out of the era where pocket watches were being converted into wristwatches. So this very much sits in that area of the prototypical phase where there was no clear defined direction of what these watches were, how they were supposed to be, and that allowed for pieces like these to be so much more creative, so much more outreaching. And you can see it here. I mean, I probably mentioned it in the beginning of the video, but the age of opulence. It celebrates opulence by the way it presents itself. But another key factor that I think is missed with a lot of watches, especially when we transition out of the 1950s, is beautification. This doesn't only have this extremely elegant look to it, but also feels like something that is beautified for the sake of it being a piece of functional jewelry. Now we look at the squared, organic, we could say tonneau-style case shape. And if we are to think about the inspirations that go into the modern, smartwatch today, how relevant does this form still look? I would say many of the design styles we are seeing today are almost reviving some of these aesthetics, which is greatly appreciated. And then if we are to focus in on the dial, looking at the Breguet numerals, the Breguet hands, there is so much to enjoy here. And another thing this piece captures, not only the opulence, the elegance, but also character. Don't you feel that it has a lot more of a lively presentation by the way it looks, by the way the numerals are defined? The 12, the 6, the 9 are slightly larger on the dial. Even the running sub-seconds, instead of being in the more logical position at the 6 o'clock, it's been shifted to 3, further emphasizing the idea of asymmetry, the idea of offsetting. What surprises me is that this watch is not viewed much by the larger community. Many are interested in pieces like FP Journe, Patek Philippe, those kinds of models that do have their own distinct design languages, and maybe that is one reason why this piece has been virtually neglected. Don't get me wrong, these aren't cheap watches, and the beauty is that they're almost unidentifiable to those who don't know what they are. Another great feature about this watch, being offset the way the dial is positioned, is that you're the only one who can tell the time. There's not only this element of discretion where you can actually judge the time by just tilting the wrist without having to do any extra work, which is something that fills the criteria of a dress watch very well. But then on top of that, the way the dial is positioned means that anyone from across the room couldn't necessarily tell the time accurately. As you can probably take away from this video, there are lots of facets to this watch that I think make for such a compelling piece. We could call it yet another reissue watch, but it's also one that has so much more to it. Maybe another downside to this watch is it's not only expensive, but it is also mechanical. It's a hand-wound movement. But if we are to look at it further, the core deterrent that I think is attached to this watch is it is just peculiar. And people don't like peculiar, or should I say a very small percentage enjoy the idea that they have a peculiar watch in their collection. Most are more interested in watches that have a clear design intent to them, where this example resembles something more of a prototype, and it is very peculiar for that reason. But there is so much to take away from an example of a watch like this. Purely from a design perspective, it epitomizes the time when it was made, that's obvious. The beauty is that it had intent to be functional at the same time, not only aiding the wearer when it comes to reading the time, but also the subtlety of how the time is read. The question we then have to ask is, why aren't more brands doing this? The thought of a more popular offset dial on a dress watch seems very appealing for its application, for all of the peculiarities that it does have. It also manages to photograph the beauty of the time when it was made, where watches were more than just functional items. They also needed to accompany outfits. And in an age today that is governed very much by uniformity and following what everyone else is doing, this is an example of an instrument that shows a lack of conformity.